Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I think one of the other candidates we're expecting is having potentially an issue with one of the links, but there's a little bit of intro that I'm going to do. So welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for the Minneapolis Ward 2 Virtual Candidate Forum, hosted by Make Homes Happen. We are so glad to have you with us this evening. My name is Jeff Washburn. I'm the Executive Director for the City of Lakes Community Land Trust here in Minneapolis. Also, in our organization is a Make Homes Happen member, and I will MC and moderate the forum this evening. A few housekeeping items before we begin. We are using Zoom webinar, which means you can see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. Please use the Q&A feature to type in any questions you have for the candidates. They'll be able to answer your questions directly in a bit. Finally, we are recording this webinar and we'll share it on Make Homes Happen Facebook page by the end of the month. As you all know, we have an important election coming up on November 2nd. It's less than 2 months away. All 13 Minneapolis City Council members and the Minneapolis mayor are up for election this year, as are all park board members and 2 board of estimate and taxation members. To see exactly who will be on your ballot, visit the Secretary of State's website on September 17th or later. For information about when, where, and how to vote, visit www.vote.minneapolismn.gov. Julia Hobart, who's managing our tech tonight, will share these links in the chat. Additionally, Minneapolis has ranked choice voting elections. This November, you will have the power to rank your first, second, and third choice candidates on your ballot. If your first choice does not continue in the instant runoff, your vote goes to the second choice. If your second choice does not continue, your vote goes on to the third choice. You should rank as many candidates as you prefer, up to 3. When you listen to the candidates this evening, consider not just your first choice, but also your second or third. Before we hear from candidates, let me tell you a little bit about Make Homes Happen. We are a coalition of community-based groups and organizations that advocate for affordable housing development, preservation, and tenant rights in Minneapolis. In 2017, we successfully pushed for a $40 million investment to the Minneapolis Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Yet, even then, the housing needs of our community far outweighed this dollars spent. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated what was already a housing crisis, and we know housing is a critical issue for our city. City leaders have significant influence on the policies, programs, and funding choices that impact our community. That's why Make Homes Happen is hosting this forum this evening. In order to ensure the fairness of our election series, Make Homes Happen used a uniform process in communicating with candidates. We approached each candidate and invited them to participate in a Zoom interview about housing. The interview included 3 questions, and candidates had 2 minutes to respond to each question. We recorded candidates' answers and we'll play them back for you now as opening statements for this event. Note that we did not edit the content of the candidate responses, but we did cut each answer off at 2 minutes. Anything that was said after 2 minutes will not be shared here today. This was done to ensure standardization across interviews we conducted. Finally, candidates who did not participate in the Zoom interview will have 2 minutes to present an opening statement live this evening. So let's get ready to hear from the candidates. Julie will play a recorded Zoom interview for us. We'll go in alphabetical order by last name, starting with Cam Gordon, the incumbent city council member. Although Cam recorded a Zoom interview with us, he was not able to participate in this evening's event because we didn't hear from his campaign by the deadline.
Affordable housing has been a priority in the last 4 years, and many policies and programs were introduced to address the housing needs of the community, some of which have passed and some are currently under discussion. Do you believe that the city is headed in the right direction when it comes to affordable housing policies? Please explain your answer.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think that Affordable housing has probably been a priority for even more than 4 years in terms of city government and what we've heard, at least from elected officials. I think in the last 4 years, we've made significant progress in kind of opening things up. We've changed a lot of our rules and regulations and focused on displacement. How can we preserve the affordable housing that we have, and also how can we get new affordable housing moving into the future? Investments in affordable housing have gone up. We've also been able to loosen the rules in terms of where shelters can locate, supportive housing, other alternatives. We've created intentional communities ordinances. We have looked at what we can do in terms of emergency shelters as well as overnight shelters. In many ways, I think we are moving in a positive and a good direction with the protections that we've given to renters. We have some things that passed recently that I myself have pushed hard on. It's taken years to get there, including last Friday when we legalized rooming houses or single room occupancy units again, which I think is a significant step in the right direction. We do have some things that are pending that I'm also working on and championing. The tenant opportunity to purchase, I support significantly. I think that could be a real game changer in terms of preventing displacement and also building wealth for people. There's so many enormous gaps, especially racial gaps in our city in terms of home ownership, but also in other areas, but that's one that's a priority. So the tenant opportunity to purchase could help with that, as well as how we're seeing people displaced and pushed out to the suburbs who are searching for affordable home ownership opportunities. I am also leading on the rent stabilization charter amendments, authored those, and they'll be on the ballot. And I think that's another step of us moving in the right direction. We also now have more eviction protections that we're working on. We have now a notice.
Time. Are there any housing policies that you think the city is currently overlooking and should be discussed? Please be specific in what policies or tools you would want to make sure are brought to the table.
Well, thank you. I think there are some tools that we're looking at, like the tenant opportunity to purchase that hasn't been passed, and also how can we better control or stabilize our rents for people. But I think there's other things that we can do. One thing that I'm really pushing on is how can we look at funding public housing in a long-term and realistic manner. I think for too long, we have thought the federal government's going to take care of that, and we haven't been engaged as we could. We have a levy, a housing levy authority that the city could enact and raise up to $8 million a year. What I would like to see us do is make a long-term commitment to doing that, to start levying for that and invest that directly in public housing, not in operations, but in capital improvements to our public housing so that we can keep it public. It's a proven, I think, tool that really has helped people for decades, but the problem with it is we don't have big enough investment. So that's one area where I really want to see us focusing in on. I also think we have to do more and look at how are we handling homelessness right now, especially in terms of the encampments and people who are living out of doors. I think we have to look at the navigation center that was established, see what the successes that were there, and we have to get more creative and create more options. We recently did a study session where we looked at Seattle and Denver where they have sanctioned or permitted encampments. I think we have to look at that as a possibility that we're going to need to do in our city instead of keep closing these encampments, and then people, some people find alternatives, but then other the same people end up finding another place to camp outside, and we need to figure out how we can get them a stable place that's acceptable to them so we can get the help to them that they need. I also think we can continue to do more, making a bigger investment in affordable housing. I think we should set a goal in terms of how much money we need. Our focus needs to be on the deeply affordable, 30% and below, and public housing, I think for now, as well as supporting naturally occurring affordable housing.
What are the practical skills and or lived experience that you would bring to your role as a city council member that could be used to help address the city's affordable housing needs?
Well, thank you very much. I think, I guess all of us will bring all of our practical skills and lived experience here. I grew up in the city of Minneapolis. Actually, the first home that my parents had was public housing. My father was a student and was got a place to live in a student housing village with his wife and two of them and my siblings. So that was some experience there. And I've grown up, lived in several places in Minneapolis as a renter. I actually was a landlord for a while. I owned and lived in a duplex complex. So I have those kind of practical experiences and different perspectives. I've certainly learned a lot in my time in City Hall about housing, funding housing, but also about the needs of the people of Minneapolis. I believe that I've been able to demonstrate that I can build coalitions, I can build partnerships, I can listen carefully, find points of consensus, and never really lose sight of what is the vision and what are the goals, so that we can keep taking steps in those directions. I think bring people together that can use information, experts to help advise policy and set that policy to make a difference. Hopefully I can continue to use those skills and help solve the housing crisis that we're facing in our city and make sure that everybody has a decent, dignified, and stable home that they choose to live in where they want to live in the city of Minneapolis.
Thank you. Thanks to current council member Cam Gordon for his comments. Now we'll hear the recorded statements of Robin Wonsley, Worlobah.
Affordable housing has been a priority in the last 4 years, and many policies and programs were introduced to address the housing needs of the community, some of which have passed and some are currently under discussion. Do you believe that the city is headed in the right direction when it comes to affordable housing policies? Please explain your answer.
Thank you for that question. In some, I would say no. Our city has not done enough to actually head in the right direction of providing affordable housing. And I think that's largely connected to specific and recent policy platforms and measures such as the 2040 plan that continuously prioritize corporate developers who are profit driven at the end of the day, who could care less about actually providing affordable housing for ordinary people. And this is why we see the market be so overwhelmed with cost burden housing. This is why we're seeing tent encampments grow. And it's largely because we have not orientated our city towards treating housing as a human right and investing in public housing and actual city-owned housing that expands everyone to have access to this right in a meaningful way. And my campaign looks forward to championing a variety of tools and policies to actually reverse this prioritization of corporate developers so that we are meeting that need.
Are there any housing policies that you think the city is currently overlooking and should be discussed? Please be specific in what policies or tools you would want to make sure are brought to the table.
Absolutely. I think the first immediate one that comes to mind are two specific policies that relate to public housing, and specifically that have been used to privatize a good number of our public housing units that, as we mentioned, in the housing crisis, we should be doing the complete opposite of. We should be protecting and creating as much public housing as possible. But those specific policy measures that once elected, I plan to reverse is RAG in Section 18 that has allowed even recent buildings like the Elliott Twins to be sold off to corporate interests and then taken off the public housing market. Another policy measure that we want to explore is a vacancy tax. We know that in many of the developments that have been created in recent years, many of those units are sitting vacant right now in the middle of a housing crisis. And we should be taxing corporate developers for not making sure that people are housed, and especially in affordable units. We should also be revisiting the AMI and lowering it to 30%. Because we know most of the housing in our market is cost burden. We should be looking at how are we actually tending and protecting NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing. But I think those are some key things that we need to be really examining as it pertains to our affordable housing that is still attached to the market, but also making sure that we're protecting our public housing allotment and expanding it.
What are the practical skills and/or lived experience that you would bring to your role as a city council member that could be used to help address the city's affordable housing needs?
Absolutely. The first I have to state as someone who does this full time and for a number of years, it's my organizing skills. It's my organizing skills that was able to make Minneapolis the first Midwestern city to pass a $15 minimum wage and actually guarantee a $30,000 annual income for our hourly workers. My activism also yielded a $2 million investment into full service community schools and making sure our students get access to fully resourced schools that meet their needs. That organizing has also been connected to recent housing justice efforts for rent control, the opportunity to purchase agreement, as well as calling out corporate real estate investors like Blackstone that has targeted a number of single family homes to bring into their portfolio to basically exchange and reap profits from the stock market. Another skill that I bring to the table is research. I have expansive research experience and background as pertains to housing. Being a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, I've worked with leading research agencies like the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, and also my coalition building skills. All of the number of social justice movements that I just stated, it took bringing diverse stakeholder groups to the table around a common interest and common agenda. And I think that's exactly what's going to be needed in order to truly make housing a human right or a guaranteed right for all of our residents in Minneapolis.
Thank you, Robin. Now we'll hear from Yusra Arab, who did not participate in the recorded Zoom interview. She will have 2 minutes to introduce herself to you. Yusra, I'll start your time when you begin speaking. Thanks. Yusra, I think you're still on mute. I'm trying to get you going here. I will let you start all over here.
Yeah, let me do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. And thank you to Make Homes Happen Minneapolis for putting together this wonderful event. My name is Yusra Arab. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a mother, an advocate, a proud Black Muslim immigrant, and a renter in the East Como neighborhood. I'm running to represent all of the diverse and vibrant communities in Ward 2 on the Minneapolis City Council. I'm running because our city is at a crossroads. We're experiencing some of the most consequential, urgent, and complex challenges in our city's history. We need leaders who are ready to meet this moment with collaboration, transparency, and the political will to get things done. I believe that I have that vision, the experience, both professional and lived, and the commitment to do just that. I understand what it feels like to be raised by a single mother who earned minimum wage as a janitor to help us get by while we lived in Section 8 housing. As a product of our city's public housing programs, I understand firsthand the importance of a stable and safe home. As a policy aide at City Hall, working closely with the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority and its tenants, I built familiarity with the finer details of housing policy. As a 24-year Minneapolis resident and a lifelong renter, I understand the incredible impact that good housing policy can have in uplifting our many diverse communities. For a decade, Minneapolis has suffered from an affordable housing crisis. For too many families, the rising cost of housing is a major obstacle to upward mobility and stability. We know that the affordable housing crisis disproportionately impacts Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and other communities of color, along with members of the LGBTQ community. Access to quality affordable housing is crucial for low and middle income families in Minneapolis and throughout our state. The increasing scarcity of affordable housing is a threat to us all, and it will only get worse if we don't take immediate and decisive action like expanding affordable housing options and strengthening our renters' rights. The COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent economic impact has exuberated.
Sorry, Yusra, I hit you at your 2-minute limit. Thank you so much for your comments. And thank you, candidates, for being here this evening and introducing yourselves to us, either just now or through the video questionnaire. We're now ready to move on to the next phase of our event, where we'd like to hear directly from candidates in response to audience questions. If you're joining us today as an audience member, please use the Q&A feature to ask any housing-related questions. I repeat, housing-related questions you have for the candidates. Make Homes Happen has prepared a few questions to get us started in the absence of any audience questions. Looks like at this point, we don't have any audience questions, but again, please consider submitting some questions to us, and we'll make sure to ask those. To be fair, we'll rotate each question with each candidate and who answers first. Candidates, you will each have 2 minutes to respond to the question. We will time you and mute you at 2 minutes. We'll start. We're going to come right back at you, Yusra, with the first question. And that question is, and I should share with everyone, I'll repeat the question so that you don't have to write that down as I ask the next candidate the same question. But start with Yusra. Describe one of the most effective policies, programs, or strategies that the city of Minneapolis could enact or continue to employ to support naturally occurring affordable housing in the market.
I would say taking away some of the red tape that currently exists, the bureaucracy that potential developers of affordable housing go through. I would also advocate for putting in place programs that would help communities get out of poverty by having option pathways to home ownership so that they can build wealth and get out of poverty that way. I would also look into various creative ways of making sure that we can add to our stock that we currently have, whether it's through TIF financing, whether it's partnering up with MPHA and other nonprofit organizations who do this work on a daily basis, and giving them dedicated funds that would help maintain the current stock that they have, but also build on that so that we can have new units on the market. Currently, I would also add with working with jurisdictional partners at the state level, as well as the federal, making sure that we can get the financing that these organizations need to maintain the stock and also add on to it. The affordable housing market has been stagnant for the past 20 years. I would also look into maybe bringing back the levy that we had 20 years ago for MPHA, and so that we can have dedicated funding towards that so that we can add to our stock, which we haven't been able to do in the past couple of decades.
Thank you, Yusra. Robin, same question, I'll repeat it. Describe one of the most effective policies, programs, or strategies that the city of Minneapolis could enact or continue to employ to support naturally occurring affordable housing in the market.
I definitely want to share that we know that consolidating most of our housing into the private market has failed. It's the reason why we have one of the worst housing crises we've seen to date in the city. And investing more housing and investing more funding through measures like TIFs back into the hands of corporate developers that are not creating affordable housing is not going to help. So one of the things I would actually say that we should really do to protect NOAA, because we are losing NOAA just as fast as we are creating new developments, because most of them are cost burden housing that we're creating, is one, passing rent control. And I want to state a strong rent control policy that is actually linked to the recommendations that the Minneapolis United for Rent Control Coalition has pushed forth. And we have the opportunity to start that process come November 2nd when it's on the ballot. So please vote yes on that. We can also strengthen measures like inclusionary zoning, because right now, and actually link that to AMI. We need to reduce AMI levels around inclusionary zoning between 30 to 50%. Because right now, let's even break it down to Ward 2, the average income, median income for Ward 2 residents is $45,000. Therefore, at 60% AMI, that means that most of the housing that we're creating is not affordable for residents. So we need to change AMI levels. We need to strengthen inclusionary zoning measures so that we can do that. We need to tax the rich to make sure we're funding housing and public housing, and pass a strong rent control policy come November.
Thank you, Robin. Appreciate your response. I'm going to come right back at you with a question from one of our audience members this evening. And that question is, would you support a dedicated source of income for affordable housing production, preservation, and tenant protections? Do you have any ideas for specific sources?
Absolutely. I just talked about taxing the rich because what I don't think is a pathway forward, especially as someone who's running as a democratic socialist, is through TIFs, through measures like levies, we keep passing the burden of financing largely unaffordable housing onto already financially constrained working class people. So it's time that the corporate developers, the corporations, big business in our communities who time and time again gets public subsidies to basically reap profits at our expense, it's time to make them pay their fair share. So when I talk about taxing the rich to create new revenue streams so that we can actually expand and fully fund public housing, to actually create land trusts, to allocate more homes, single family homes into land trusts so that they stay public. That means looking at doing an Airbnb tax. The fact that some of these new developments under the 2040 plan are sitting vacant and actually posted on Airbnb when we literally have people at the Franklin, light rail stop living in tents, that makes absolutely no sense. So I'm actually looking at Airbnb taxations. Again, taxing the rich like corporate developers, enacting fees on them because we provide too many subsidies for them and give them just a blank check to build housing that is not meeting a need. So I think those are two measures that we can start looking at to actually generate progressive revenue to meet some of these crises and take the weight off of working class people's shoulders who heavily fund all of our public services already.
Thank you, Robin. Appreciate your response. Yusra, same question, I'll repeat it. Would you support a dedicated source of income for affordable housing production, preservation, and tenant protections? Do you have ideas for specific sources?
Yes, absolutely. I do support that. Like I said a few minutes ago, a levy would be an option, but also all public funding and resources must target deeply affordable housing for the quarter of the city that residents whose household earn 30% AMI and below. Increase the inclusionary zoning targets and requirements until we meet those citywide goals that we have. Public funding mechanisms such as TIF money, incremental financing, and federal economic recovery programs as well. We should use that to primarily use it towards housing other crises that we're currently experiencing.
Thank you, Yusra. Appreciate your response. I'm going to come right back at you now with another question from an audience member. And that question is, how would your personal experiences impact the way that you will advocate for those that you are elected to serve who are experiencing housing instability and or a lack of affordable housing?
How my personal experience would be an asset? Is that what you're asking? Well, like I said earlier in my introduction, I grew up in public housing, later on moved on to a Section 8 voucher. I understand what it feels like to be consistently looking at your income and making sure that you meet that bottom line in order to, keep your voucher so that my mom could keep her voucher so she wouldn't be kicked out. I've also throughout my entire life been an advocate for housing and housing needs, whether I was 10 years old interpreting for my mom at MPHA or at a landlord's office or helping relatives deal with unjust landlords. And even in my time as a policy aide, one of the major things that I dealt with on a daily basis, and it wasn't just in the parameters of Ward 6 and where I worked at, but rather throughout the city and even sometimes in St. Paul, were residents who didn't speak the language, who were having difficulties with their landlords or not communicating very well with their housing authority and being taken advantage of, and going out of my way to speak up and go to their hearings and make sure that they have all the resources necessary so that they can either keep their homes or get their deposit back or whatever the issue that they're facing at that time is. So I do have a wealth of lived experience dealing with housing scarcity while I lived in Minneapolis. So I think that would be an asset coming in.
Thank you, Yusra.
Absolutely.
All right. Same question for you, Robin. How would your personal experiences impact the way that you will advocate for those that you are elected to serve who are experiencing housing instability and or a lack of affordable housing?
My lived experience as a Black woman who grew up on the South Side of Chicago and literally saw the blueprint be made for how to decimate public housing. Literally, Chicago is at the core of that, and we've picked that right on up here in Minneapolis. But nevertheless, using those lived experiences, has really guided the work that I've done as an organizer. Having been a minimum wage worker, having, lived on $20,000 a year, I knew what that struggle was like. And that's why in 2016, I immediately joined, our worker-led movements to fight for a $15 minimum wage and made Minneapolis the first city to do so. And also, I'm really proud to say that we were among the first campaign in this race in Ward 2 to champion rent control measures after elected leaders, especially those currently sitting in office, said in 2017 and prior to then that this is something that could never happen. It's legally impossible. And look, now we actually have it on the ballot, and it took organizing to make that happen. And I'll continue to do that once elected. Also using my lived experience as a renter, and also a renter who's been impacted by the 2040 plan. Since moving here in Minneapolis 6 years ago, I've moved 5 times. I, in fact, moved from a development in our ward because they charged $2,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment that was 500 square foot. That is not the type of housing that we need, and I will not continue to support corporate development like that. I've had extensive research background as a PhD candidate. As I've mentioned, I've done tons of studies with centers like the Urban for Regional Affairs on the housing crises and the ways in which we can improve public housing and actually strengthen, measures like rent control to attack this crisis in front of us. And then relationships with elected leaders. I think, being the only candidate in this race endorsed by leaders like Angela Conley and Nelson Yang and Londale French, Cedric Frazier, using those relationships at the state level.
Sorry, Robin, I had to cut you off. We hit 2 minutes. Thank you for your response. I just want to also acknowledge, thank you to the audience members. Really good questions coming in. And I'm going to come back at you, Robin, with what I think is a doozy of a question. I looked at it and I'm struggling with. So heads up, candidates. The next question is to Robin. How do we make sure we include more businesses owned by BIPOC persons in the production and preservation of affordable housing?
How do we include more BIPOC businesses?
Businesses owned by BIPOC persons. Yep.
Sorry, I'm trying to, I know I could have the question be read one more time.
Sure. So how do we make sure we include more businesses owned by BIPOC persons in the production and preservation of affordable housing? So I think, and the audience member can correct me here, but my sense of this question is, in the production and the preservation and the management and administration of affordable housing, how do we make sure that we have more businesses owned by BIPOC individuals being part of that system?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the first ways that we can do that is actually diversifying the bidding process. We know corporate developers, and there is a handful of corporate developers that actually produce a large number of housing in our city. So knowing that there is a monopoly on this that prevents, smaller level, or aspiring BIPOC developers to come in and actually make the housing that is either culturally relevant or specific to certain communities. So I think we won't be able to actually have them be included as long as a monopoly of this industry continues. And one of the ways that we can do that is actually through funding public housing, bringing them in to actually develop public lands, giving them subsidies to make sure that we're developing not only public housing, but also land cooperatives, housing cooperatives. Of course, I'm coming at it as there is no need to keep developing private or profit-driven housing. I think one of the ways in which we can actually incentivize BIPOC developers is using land that we already have, public lands, to develop that for public housing. And yeah, I think that's a starting place. And I'm sorry to time myself too.
Thank you, Robin. I didn't start your time when I gave the clarifying comments, so you actually had a couple more, 20 or so more seconds. Are you complete? Okay, thank you. Yusra, back at you with the same question, which I'll read again. How do we make sure we include more businesses owned by BIPOC persons in the production and preservation of affordable housing?
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. I guess we can involve different businesses throughout the whole process, from the start through construction, all the way throughout to management. So there are various organizations that currently exist and companies that work with other bigger developers in order to develop sort of tailored communities for specific communities in our city. We can give out incentives and advocate communities to build their own, or even give out parcels, city-owned and county-owned parcels for development, as long as they're going to make that development into an affordable housing and meet those standards and put standards in place to do that. There's wealth of ideas, I'm sure, out there to incorporate small businesses so they can be part of the process. Even when it comes to shelters, for example, we can advocate for more culturally specific shelters that cater to certain groups in our demographics. And it's just, I don't think it's an area that we've paid a lot of attention to, and it's a great idea, and we should look into that.
Thank you, Yusra. I'm gonna move on to the next question. Back at you, Yusra. Do you think the city currently has adequate funding and policies to advance the production of new affordable and accessible housing stock?
I do think that they do have the funding necessary in place. I do know that the city has done a lot by putting together and putting money towards the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. But the question of, is the political will there for them to actually implement it and push it? I do not think so. This isn't a crisis that started with COVID or even a couple of years prior to that. We've been experiencing an affordable housing crisis for as long as I've lived in Minnesota. So it's been an issue that's at the forefront. We just haven't had the political will there, or the dedication or understanding or compassion towards pushing some of these ideas and making sure that we can actually implement them, not just collecting money in a fund somewhere. So that is my answer. No, they haven't. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and more nuanced work. Thank you.
Yusra. Robin, same question. Do you think the city currently has adequate funding and policies to advance the production of new affordable and accessible housing stock?
Let's be clear, like starting, off, the money is there. It's definitely a lack of political will, but also lack of leadership. And I'll name specifically, looking at our current mayor, Jacob Fry, who in 2017, made the statement that he would end homelessness in 5 years. And again, we've seen tenant encampments continue to grow under that leadership. And the reason why is because we continue to pour subsidies like tips, more money into corporate developers and give them free reign to go and build largely cost burden housing that benefits and is not accessible to anyone. So I want to make clear that the money is there. We are sitting on $180 million just in influx, funding from the federal government. That as opposed to investing a large percentage of that, we're talking, 50%, 60%, 100% into housing. We have a mayor and city council members and corporate forces that are also driving campaigns against rent control and Yes for Minneapolis, like all of Minneapolis and Operation Safety Now, literally championing to pour that money into policing. So it is the political will. It's also the reason why we need elected leaders who are grounded in our movements, who've been having a track record of fighting alongside renters for strong protections for actual public housing and housing affordability for everyone in order to take on that type of leadership and actually address this crisis.
Thank you, Robin. Just take a sec here to encourage our audience members. If you have a question related to affordable housing, City of Minneapolis, affordable housing in Ward 2, please feel free to ask those questions in the Q&A tab of the Zoom meeting here, and we'll make sure to ask those. Robin, I'm going to come back to you with the next question. Consider what you know about cost burden and vulnerable renters in the city. What will you do as a city council member to improve or create systems and policies that improves the overall quality and accessibility of their housing options? Pretty long question. All right.
I think immediately starting and with the fact that this next incoming city hall, they're going to have two major policy mandates to deal with, one with public safety and one around housing through rent control. And they're very much interrelated because housing is public safety and public safety is housing. So I think the first measure is making sure that we know the wing behind Jacob Fry, corporate developers, the real estate lobbyists are going to fight hard to create a weak policy around rent control. And we are going to have leaders like myself in office who are going to, partner and bring coalitions together, work with existing movements that's been championing, strong policy recommendations for rent control to make that language a reality when we get to the point of passing an ordinance. So starting with passing a strong rent control policy. The second is also addressing AMI. We need to be lowering that from 60% between 50 to 30%. We also need to be making sure that we are not applying the metro-wide AMI requirement, which is largely why we don't see affordable housing being developed, because it's not fit to a Minneapolis average median income. So we need to be adjusting that. We need to be fully funding and expanding public housing instead of supporting the measures that's happening in NPHA, where we're seeing measures like RAD and Section 18 be used to privatize our public housing allotments. We need to be expanding land trusts and land cooperatives. And these are all the measures that I plan to champion. And of course, doing this through taxing the rich, enacting fees on corporate developers to fund these measures so that working class people don't have to do it anymore.
Thanks, Robin. Yusra, same question to you. I'll repeat it. Considering what you know about cost burden and vulnerable renters in the city, what will you do as a city council member to improve or create systems and policies that improves the overall quality and accessibility of their housing options?
Yeah, thank you. I would start off with a housing first model, like cities like Houston have, in order to combat the increasing homelessness in our city. Create office of tenants advocate so that there's a place for tenants to come to and they would meet with someone to advocate for them. Tenant opportunity to purchase, have that in place. Hopefully with the passing of the amendment, have a universal rent control in place as well. Just cause eviction protection, anti-retaliation protection, and the right to to a council in case you are evicted are all things that we could put in place to help our most vulnerable residents in our city.
Thank you, Yusra. Next question is going to come back at you. And that question is, what is your position on, and I should acknowledge both of you have talked a little bit about rent stabilization. What is your position on rent stabilization charter amendment that will be on this year's ballot? And your views in enacting a future rent stabilization policy within Minneapolis?
Yeah, great question. So this amendment doesn't institute a rent control necessarily. It only gives the council the option to institute one later on through ordinance because of our state statute. But I am in support of it, and I do think it's up to Minneapolis residents to take up rent control. But if we do, I want us to keep in mind we need to incorporate into that process lessons learned from other cities who've already implemented, whether it's in New York or San Francisco, and so that we need to look into the lessons learned, what were some of the shortcomings, what were some of the mistakes made, and incorporate that into our processes when it comes to time to implement that ordinance. And that's what I'd like to say.
Thanks, Yusra. Robin, what is your position on rent stabilization charter amendment that will be on this year's ballot, and your views in enacting a future rent stabilization policy within Minneapolis?
Absolutely. And I just want to highlight again, when we launched our campaign and was the first as a challenger, we launched our campaign around this time last year, and we literally did so on rent control. None of our existing incumbents or challengers at the time even raised that as a demand, because we know how important it is. And we know that City Hall has continued to deny it as a viable pathway towards addressing our housing crisis. So I've been an avid supporter, throughout my campaign, and have worked and supported, the efforts of the coalitions on the ground that has been doing the necessary organizing to even make it be possible to be on the ballot this November. So completely a supporter of it. And I'm also glad that San Francisco and New York was raised, because what we should take from that is that the policies in those cities were weakened because we had corporate developers, we had real estate lobbyists, we had leadership that was also in the pockets of real estate lobbyists, as well as corporate developers, who did everything that they could to weaken and water down those policies so they had no meaningful impact. And to really combat that, I see the strongest rent control policy that is going to have to happen once we're in a process where we can draft ordinance language is actually implementing the Minneapolis United Rent Control Coalition's proposal, which, tying annual rent increases to 3%, making sure we're applying rent control to all properties with rental licenses, making sure we're restricting the amounts of renovations and repair expenses that landlords pass on to tenants, applying rent control retroactively, and also making sure that there is funding to enforce these mandates. And that's going to be a battle because we know Jacob Fry do not want to see a strong policy happen, as well as the corporate developers that currently dominate our housing market right now and are largely the culprits of the crises that we're experiencing. So that's what I'm looking forward to championing when I'm in office and get to actually put this into policy.
Thank you, Robin. This next question is coming to you, Robin. Describe your direct experience establishing, maintaining, and supporting varied and complex partnerships. How will you use this experience as a city council member?
So many examples, because I've been able to do coalition building work for most of my life here in Minneapolis. I'm going to use the example for sure of, the 15 minimum wage campaign. We organized that campaign for over 4 years because City Hall, our existing leadership, refused to adhere to workers' demands that they were not able to have a quality of life in the city. They were working 2 to 3 jobs to make ends meet. And we said, that's not right. We need to be following the calls of our workers in New York. We need to be following the calls of our workers in Chicago who are saying we need 15 and we need it now. And in order to make that happen, in order to overcome the hoops and obstacles that City Hall threw our way, we had to build a robust and broad multiracial coalition that included unions, that included students, that included homeowners, that included business owners, that included hospitality workers. And a lot of that on my end, as one of the lead organizers for that campaign, was doing one-to-one meetings, showing up when those constituent groups were also having meetings, doing informational presentations, keeping them up to date on, the research that was affirming that 15 minimum wage was not going to create a collapse of society that the big business community constantly threatened throughout that time that we were campaigning. It took doing a lot of direct actions. We were constantly in the streets, literally having workers in the streets every weekend, doing direct actions, going into City Hall meetings, and making it known that there is no way that any elected leader can say they support racial and economic justice and deny workers a $30,000 annual income. So it takes that messy work of doing the organizing, showing up repeatedly, checking in when there's points of confusion, and being very direct about what those points of confusions are and figuring out how to problem solve together. And those are all the things that's going to be necessary in order to pass a strong record.
Thanks, Robin. I know you look like you're getting pretty close, but I had to cut you off. Yusra, same question about partnerships. Describe your direct experience establishing, maintaining, and supporting varied and complex partnerships. How will you use this experience as a city council member?
I'll look back into my time at City Hall in 3 different occasions. The first one was making sure building relationship between MPD and the community, where through 6-month period, we had a series of meetings and events that we hosted between elders and the youth in the community, talking to various individuals from MPD and the city as a whole, whether it's through the council member, the mayor, and so forth and so on. And they were very fruitful. We ended up creating a mothers group out of that, who ended up going to City Hall during the hearings to advocate for their community. On another occasion, I worked on putting together a business event through the city, because the city has a tendency to overlook communities of color who have a language barrier when it comes to attaining and having access to resources. So we were able to put together an event where the entire, from licensings to CPET to every entity attended, and various community members and business owners came to that event so that they can directly get contacted and interact with people that they needed to in order for their businesses to thrive and be more sustainable. I've also worked with public housing residents when it came to the implementation of RAD and Section 18 and Demolition 18, where we were able to draft up a memorandum of understanding with MPHA and the city, with the city's city attorney, to make sure that residents put in place and had a contract in hand so that they stayed protected and were not displaced in the future. So I can look to those events and use that to guide and help me when in office.
Thank you, Yusra. This question, we'll start with you, Yusra. It's from one of our attendees this evening. More of a focused Ward 2 question. It states, or questions, how are you working across Ward 2 to reach out and build a coalition of voters who prioritize affordable housing policies to rank you on their ballot this fall, and how would you continue to incorporate residents if elected?
That's a great question. So I've lived in the Southeast Coleman neighborhood for the past 13 years. And of all the years I've lived here, I have not once interacted with a representative from this area. And the area in which I live in is predominantly folks of color. So we've been isolated and segregated from the larger community in Ward 2, which is one of the reasons why actually I was prompted to run by my neighbors and my community members so that I can actually be a voice for them. They felt like they didn't have a voice in the last 16 years while we lived here. And throughout my campaign, I was able to knock at every door and have conversations and lengthy conversations with delegates and residents from all corners of Ward 2. In different demographics and economic brackets when you look at it. And they all agree on some of our shared principles and some of our shared values. And I hope to think that I would be the person who bridges that gap and that all corners of Ward 2 has representation and somebody that they can approach and don't feel isolated or disregarded. So yeah.
Thank you, Yusra. Question to you, Robin. Same is, how are you working across Ward 2 to reach out and build a coalition of voters who prioritize affordable housing policies to rank you on their ballot this fall? And how would you continue to incorporate residents if elected? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm definitely proud to say that I'm the only challenger in this race that has probably completed 2 passes of the ward, meaning we've already talked to more than 9,000 voters in our ward. And we've done so also in partnership with Minneapolis United for Rent Control. As I mentioned, we were the first to endorse rent control and say we was running on it. So as early as February, we've done lit drops, in tandem with the Merck Coalition. We've, done door knocks every day. We're handing out literature saying, support rent control, make sure you're voting, keeping pressure on City Hall to make sure that we have the strongest policy possible come November and beyond. And I'm really proud to say that, we've been able to touch more than 8,000 voters and already create a basis of knowledge and understanding around why it's so important to pass a strong rent control mandate. We've also built a strong coalition around key leaders in the ward. Again, as I mentioned, Angela Conley, who's endorsed us, she also represents our ward as well. And knowing that we're going to have support at the county level to really strategize around key issues impacting residents in our communities. We have a strong coalition of unions that have endorsed us that we continue and plan to continue to work with throughout our tenure as, a candidate and as an elected leader. We have Unite Here, which represents hospitality workers. We have the support of our teachers in our communities. And we look forward to really building those relationships and leveraging them when we're in office. We're also among the only candidates saying that we will actually use our salary to create a community office and create a memorandum of understanding with all of our residents and endorsed organizations so that we're very clear on what is the work that we're going to be accomplishing together over the course of the 2 years that I'm elected, and hopefully more than that because of redistricting, and really making sure that their voices and their leadership is guiding all the all of the decisions that I'm making, because that's what we're here for. We're here to represent the needs.
Thanks, Robin. Robin, this question is for you. As a city council member, how would you approach increasing the city's effectiveness at consistently growing and maintaining affordable and accessible rental and owner housing stock in the city?
I'm going to ask you to repeat that one again.
Sure. And I'll say this for the benefit of both candidates here, really kind of thinking about it from a lens of preservation, taking advantage of the housing that we already have. As a city council member, how would you approach increasing the city's effectiveness at consistently growing, but also maintaining affordable and accessible rental and owner housing stock in the city?
Got you. Okay, the first part is, one, we need to be investing, maximizing investments into public housing. And the last thing that we should be doing is privatizing it, which is exactly what we're doing through measures like RAD in Section 18. So we're actually removing public housing allotments in a housing crisis away from public access. We need to stop with that, number one. We need to also be investing. We have tons of lands, vacant lots that will sell for cheap to corporate developers. We need to be developing that. When we talked about earlier, the opportunity to bring in BIPOC developers and businesses, here's the opportunity to do so and actually subsidize those projects and keep that housing within the public good. We can be using our foreclosure allotment, putting those into land trusts instead of selling those off, also to corporate developers like Havenbrook and Blackstone that are using these homes and the rents that they're collecting to trade on the stock market and collect profits. We need to be stopped doing that. So we can, transfer our, foreclosed homes into land trusts. We can also be, again, passing measures like rent control. We can also make sure that we're protecting natural affordable occurring housing through reducing the AMIs and making sure that we're increasing the number from 8% to 10%. And I would actually say we should say 20%. The housing crisis that we have of any new developments needs to be at between 30 to 50% AMI, period. So I think those are some of the measures that we can actually do to actually protect what we have and to grow it. And of course, tax the rich to keep funding our own. The private market is not working. It continues to fail us every day. And it's time to stop investing in, measures that are broken and fail our communities and residents and tenants every single day.
Thanks, Robin. Yusra, same question, again, through a preservation lens. As a city council member, how would you approach increasing the city's effectiveness at consistently growing and maintaining affordable and accessible rental and ownership housing stock in the city?
Yes, thank you. That's a good question. So revisiting some of the things that I've previously said. So creating the Office of Tenant Advocates, making sure that we put in place tenant opportunity to purchase whenever available. Rent control would go a long way towards effectively helping residents stay in their homes. Just cause eviction, making sure that we strengthen our renters' rights so that they can stay in the communities that they currently live in and want to stay in. Making sure that we look towards restating the levy with MPHA so that MPHA has the ability to add to their stock as well as maintain the current stock that they have. Make sure that we fully fund and help with Section 8 housing so that we don't, and also make it so that an individual with a voucher can live at all 13 wards and not necessarily create islands of poverty, making sure that we don't concentrate affordable housing in certain areas, but rather that we can build affordable housing throughout the city. And even in Ward 13 and 12 and 11 and more affluent areas. Those are some of the things that I would look into working towards. Also helping current nonprofits that do this work, like Common Bound and PPL and other various organizations that build and maintain affordable housing, and affordable meaning a 30 AMI of people's income and not necessarily the area. Adding more dedicated funding into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and using that and utilizing that and making sure that we create different avenues for home ownership as well. And we don't solely focus on renters and renting only, but give opportunity to communities so that they can get out of poverty and build generational wealth.
Thank you, Yusra. I want to just thank you both for hanging in there. We have roughly about 20 minutes left. We have a number of other questions. Want to take a quick moment to again encourage attendees. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar here, and we'll ask the candidates those questions over some of our stock questions. Yusra, you see areas of opportunity within the city's approach and scope of oversight of rental housing through regulatory services. If so, or not, what and why? Do you see areas of opportunity? And I'm assuming here the question is, do you see opportunities to do better within the city's approach and scope of oversight of rental housing and regulatory services?
So inspections and so forth?
I think all the functions within regulatory services at the city of Minneapolis.
Yeah. Yes, we can be more insightful in how we do inspections and how we make sure that we don't have landlords who are neglecting their tenants, making sure that we can catch issues early on and make sure that they're all up to date and in code and they're not violating any codes or neglecting their tenants. So I do, if that's what the question's asking, but it's still a little vague. I'm not quite sure what the question's asking, but yeah, we do have a long way to go in improving that and extending and expanding it.
Thank you, Yusra. Same question, Robin. Again, do you see any areas of opportunity? And I'll read into this because the question doesn't speak to it directly, and I think Yusra answered it in the intended way as well. There's opportunities for improvement within the city's approach and scope of oversight of rental housing through regulatory services. If so or not, why, what, and why?
Absolutely. Thank you for really bringing up this question. It reminds me, again, I mentioned earlier that I did pretty extensive research on our housing crisis with Cura and actually on MPHA. And one of the things that came up was actually regulatory services. And one of the things that we learned is that we don't regulate, corporate development. We don't regulate very much of anything around housing development in Minneapolis. And when it comes to especially scattered sites or, voucher-based like public housing or subsidized housing, we often saw that landlords got to dictate, like literally, and we're talking about disproportionately Black and brown working class folks, especially over in North Minneapolis, living in subpar housing conditions, had needed maintenance, or had overdue maintenance requests that did not get fulfilled. And they would bring these, concerns to MPHA, and literally folks would say, we can't do anything. We can't enforce the landlord. So that brings me to the point of enforcement. We need to be strengthening enforcement, in any corporate landlords and developers that are in violation of these standards need to be facing penalties. There needs to be stronger mandates on what landlords can and cannot do. And if so, your license needs to be stripped from you. We don't need any more Steve Frenzes in our communities that went for 10 plus years providing subpar housing conditions, but yet did so with a rental license still. We need to be reversing that and stopping that. Some of the clearest measures we can do to actually regulate housing is, again, passing measures like rent control that tackles corporate developers. Also, TOPA. That is one of the things that actually puts ownership back into the hands of tenants themselves instead of corporate developers or outside Wall Street buyers or investment firms.
Thank you, Robin. Next question, coming from one of our attendees. It's a good one as well. When the corporate developers come calling on your office, how can we be sure that you will advocate for everyday people?
That's me, right?
Yes.
All right. I'll start with a clear example. So this is a challenge I put out to a lot of other candidates. Right now, the Minnesota Association for Realtors, MARS, which are staunchly against rent control, as well as TOPA, are screening candidates. These are real estate lobbyists that poured a lot of energy and resources towards defeating the People's Pathway petition for rent control, and also are sending mailers as we're speaking to residents saying, don't support TOPA. So we publicly came out and said we will not be seeking their endorsements. We do not want funding or any donations coming from real estate lobbyists, from corporate developers, the very forces that we know create the housing crises that we're seeing and experiencing every single day. And also how you know I'm not going to be in their pockets is because I'm championing measures that's being organized by renters. Rent control is on the ballot because of renters. TOPA is on the ballot because renters had the bravery to take on Steve French, one of our city's worst slumlords, and say, no, you will actually sell your properties to us, the ones who you made your wealth and money off of. We're going to take ownership over that now. So I think those are some of the clearest ways in which you can see I'm going to stay and remain in partnership with our renters, with working class people. And also why I'm running as a democratic socialist, because I believe in the power of working class people to make change.
Thanks, Robin. Yusra, when the corporate developers come calling on your office, how can we be sure that you will advocate for everyday people?
That's a really good question. My life experience would say otherwise. I'm a long life renter. I'm a byproduct of my community, and my community was historically neglected when it comes to landlords and housing in general, and housing issues. Therefore, as an advocate and a lifelong advocate for almost half of my life, I would never succumb to or please a developer, nor throughout our entire campaign, we haven't had $1 from any developer or anybody outside of the community, actually. So my community has my back and I have theirs, and that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Yusra. Question for you, Yusra.
Sure.
What is your, we just spoke a little bit about TOPA. What is your position on the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act policy for Minneapolis? That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, based on your position, what impact do you think it will have on the residents who live in rental properties?
Yeah, I support it 100%. I believe that those who are living in and maintaining these buildings should be given the opportunity to purchase them and build wealth in their communities. I think TOPA could be a great tool for combating gentrification and privatization in our communities. And I'm open to having conversations about how we can make that a reality come November when I'm in office.
Thank you, Yusra.
Welcome.
Same question, Robin. What is your position on a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act policy, TOPA, for Minneapolis? First part of the question. Second part, based on your position, what impact do you think it will have on the residents who live in rental properties?
Absolutely. I'm an avid supporter. Again, my campaign has been organizing around these issues from our very launch. In fact, in February, we hosted a housing forum where we had over 80 folks attend, and we talked about why residents should be supporting measures like rent control and like TOPA. So we've been building on the ground as we're, hitting the doors and talking to thousands of residents in our ward and across the city, why they should be supporting measures like this. And also making sure that the impact that it'll have is, of course, taking the monopoly away from corporate developers. We're seeing a huge crisis right now where homes, especially in Ward 2, where folks are becoming older, they're looking to sell their homes. And instead of going through the traditional home buying process, we're seeing an influx of Wall Street investment firms like Havenbrook and Blackstone buy these homes and thus put them into private, into a private portfolio, forever gone from like public access. So measures like TOPA will actually shift that dynamic. It will actually allow the tenants to be the owners and to keep it as a public good and to keep it publicly accessible and hopefully affordable as well. So I think those are measures, it's a measure that is definitely a stepping stone in the right direction. And I also want to advocate that it should apply to all single family homes. Right now, City Hall has done little to really make TOPA happen. And we're going to need elected leaders who are just like rent control, fight for the strongest TOPA policy, and that means making sure it applies to all homes, no exemptions.
Thanks, Robin. We have about 10 minutes left here. As the moderator and MC, I'm been kicking around in affordable housing for a bit. So I'm going to take the opportunity to try and formulate a question. My apologies to you, Yusra, because I didn't write it down. So I'm going to try and remember it so that you both get the same question here. But one of the tensions that I've experienced over the years, kind of in the affordable housing space, is this tension between existing housing getting converted to student housing. And I think Ward 2 has really struggled with this over the years. What is your approach in balancing kind of the needs of the university and its population with affordable housing in Ward 2? Again, that's to you, Robin.
This is a really good question, because I think we want to recognize, especially as we're talking to students at the doors right now, is we have a reality where corporate developers have completely taken over, the areas surrounding the University of Minnesota. And we're seeing the new luxury units that's being developed and targeted towards students. They're charging, above market rate, prices to students who are currently entrenched in student debt. Like, they're having to do a lot to work multiple jobs while going to school to pay their rent. Some of them are even paying $1,000 to rent a room with another person in a 1-bedroom apartment. So this housing crisis is heavily impacting our students. And just as much as your ordinary, renter will benefit from measures like rent control, so will our students, because they are heavily paying for cost burden housing. And we know they don't have the incomes to really meet these rising rents that they're being burdened with. So I definitely agree, rent control is one of the measures to stop that. Also, I had the opportunity prior to moving into Seward, I live in the Como Student Community Cooperative. So again, I would love to see more measures like that, where, there's housing that is being governed and owned by students. It was the most affordable in the camp on campus. Like, let's actually develop more of that student collectively owned housing. Let's also expand public housing. Glendale is right there, and it's been under attack through means or measures like Section 18 and RAD to privatize it. Let's actually expand public housing allotments so students can also, go to those instead of having to, fill up 2 bedrooms by like 6 people. So I think those are some of the ways in which we can actually start to support our students with their dire housing needs.
Thank you, Robin. Yusra, same question. One of the tensions I've experienced is the tension between existing housing getting converted to student housing. What is your approach in balancing the needs of the university and its population with affordable housing in Ward 2?
So although it's been some time, it's been a decade since I was last at the U, from the current market, I couldn't afford any of these apartments at my current position, let alone being a student 10 years ago, right? Coming from a poor family and a low-income family, and being the first person to graduate college in my family, I wouldn't have been able to be on campus or have that opportunity to experience the real life, what it feels to be on campus. As Robin said, every corner in Dinkytown, and I live in Dinkytown, there's a new luxury apartment going up. And I question myself, who's affording this? Who's moving into these apartments? I'm not sure. My life as a college student wouldn't have allowed me to afford any of these apartments with 5 roommates in one room, let alone by myself. So I think we need to focus on more affordable, maybe single unit housing in the U of M area, and make sure that we promote, incentivize, and have organizations such as PPL, who has an apartment right across from where I live. And it's divided into 2 sections. One section is for students, and the other section is for the greater population. Maybe replicate that in other parts of the ward and make sure that we can have affordable housing for our students. As well as, what else I was going to add to it is increase, since with the passing of the SROs and rooming houses, maybe that can come into use as well and go a long way towards helping these high prices come down and give more options to students on campus.
Great, thank you, Yusra. So this is going to be our final question. I'm hopeful that you all, if you have any final comments, you'll wrap this into your 2 minutes here. So the question is, this will come first to Yusra, is outline 2 or 3 steps you will take to cultivate constructive and effective working relationships with city staff and other council members and or the mayor.
It's a really good question, especially at the state of our current city council. So having worked there for 4 years, I already have established relationships with different directors in different departments throughout the city, as well as different council members. And I'm a collaborator by nature. So for me, regardless of whether or not we agree on key issues, I would love to come to the table and actually come with a compromise that would effectively work for all of our constituents. We're never going to have it our way, but as an advocate, I will always be an advocate and extension of my community. But nonetheless, when it comes to important issues that affect the entire city, I would love to collaborate with different council members and elected officials, and also throughout different jurisdictions as well, working with the county when it comes to human services and issues that deal with human services, working with the state, with our state colleagues in reforming some of the issues that exist at the state level as well. I also have built relationships when it comes to different organizations such as Pride in Living, as well as Common Bound and MPHA itself as well. I've worked hand in hand with MPHA workers throughout the 4 years I was there. It was actually one of the most constant thing that I did almost every single day. So I've already built relationships at City Hall. I've built relationships with different labor unions who were able to endorse us on our campaign. I have working relationship with the mayor's office as well. And I would love to be that person who collaborates and works with everybody to get things done and have our city moving forward.
Thank you, Yusra. Robin, same question. Outline 2 or 3 steps you will take to cultivate constructive and effective working relationships with city staff, other city council members, and or the mayor.
I'm actually on the opposite side of compromise. 15 minimum wage didn't happen through compromise. Having full service community schools did not happen through compromise. Having any advancements that we have right now on public safety did not happen through compromise. It happened through organizing broad coalitions of unions, of students, of workers, of homeowners, to know that their collective interest is making sure that everyone has housing, everyone can live in communities, that everyone gets the same quality of safety, making sure that everyone can live in communities where they can breathe and not inhale pollution. So I see the pathway towards addressing those issues at its core is actually knowing what are you advocating for. And for me, I make it very clear, I am for universal housing. I am for public housing. I am for the expansion of schools, public schools in our communities. I'm for climate justice. I'm for public safety beyond policing. And I think by knowing what you stand for, that can help you best facilitate your relationships with the elected leaders, with the city staffers, because now you know what is bringing everyone to the table. What are we trying to accomplish together? And I think by leading with these key issues that I know is impacting everyday people and working class people in our city, then I can go down and have a conversation with council members and say, look, if our best interest is to make a strong rent control policy happen, or to make sure that this new Department of Public Safety is actually not going to produce more George Floyds and actually produce the safety that you can get on Summit Avenue in St. Paul, how can we do that together? And also, let's bring the folks who are most impacted by these decisions and issues to the table to help us co-create strong, equitable policies. So for me, it's leading with the issues and leading.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Yusra. I want to really sincerely take a moment to just thank you both for participating tonight. I think we plowed through 14 questions, a lot of affordable housing questions and great responses to you both. Thank you for participating in the forum this evening. As we wrap this up, it's important that voters hear directly from you about the issues that matter, and we are grateful for your time and willingness to talk about affordable housing in our city. For both of you that would like to do so, Please share in the chat an email address or a contact page for voters to follow up if they have any additional questions. So I'd encourage you both to do that now if you'd like to do so. To all those who attended the event this evening, thank you for joining us this evening. If you have any other questions related to affordable housing, you can contact candidates through the information they're sharing here, hopefully. Be sure to follow Make Homes Happen on Facebook. For the audience sake, this is the second of 13 wards that we'll be hosting, hopefully. And then we'll be hosting a mayoral forum too throughout the month. So if you go online through the Facebook page, you'll see what the schedule is for those forums. And that's at Make Homes Happen Minneapolis, or MPLS, as we'll share a recording of this forum on that page as well. And so again, thank you. We're going to wait a few minutes before ending the call so that attendees can write down the candidates' information as needed. I just want to again say thank you to the candidates, say thank you for those who joined us this evening. Thanks to the members who put out some really great questions for us. And again, encourage folks to check out the other forums as you're able. Thank you.